Do 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 do. Extras.
So everyone who has been exposed to D&D knows that acid and fire stop trolls from regenerating. And honestly, the 5 hit points per round that they regenerate only matter if you're a little under level. If you're higher level than the trolls, 5 hit points is like nothing. But the indestructible trolls, I like that concept. I like the idea that you kill a troll and suddenly you have an implacable recurring villain. And I love the idea that these trolls, because they survive so much longer, become smarter and sneakier and irrational vengeful. I mean, regular trolls probably don't die of old age, but sooner or later a dragon or something wanders by and they're like, ugh, please be lightning, please be lightning. Oh, fire! Why did it have to be fire? This is bullshit! Cheap ass fire! What a rip-off! But thanks to Delvash, indestructible trolls wander the world for ages, and I figured they get smarter and start collecting loot, too. In practice, they didn't work out this way. Like, I knew players would take the indestructible jaws, obviously, but I sort of blew it by not having them pop out of the jaws before the PCs knew what would happen. Putting them on Little One's shield made it a little harder, though it was a hilarious opportunity for the GE7 double take. I should have had them pop out during a fight in Ginneron, but things were getting rough in there. Also, I forgot. Plus, if they hadn't found a way to find GE7, I would have had much longer to spring the troll ambush. When they were resting would have been awesome. Once they were discovered, Little One did make it pretty awesome, but I ultimately didn't get to use the trolls as originally planned. Also, the video sort of implied that he trained the trolls in Daggerface a bunch while they were en route, but in reality, they were only with the trolls a couple weeks or so definitely not long enough for them to learn Mountain Hammer. That part of the deal would happen more after they hypothetically come back to pick up the trolls and prepare for war against the Diluvians. The Diluvians must have spent so much effort putting up hundreds upon hundreds of 10-foot-tall stone pillars topped with the teeth of massive dire sharks. 50 miles inland, in many places there were rivers which the aquatic slaves could breathe and rest in, but these had to be widened into canals in order to pack in the labor force, and copious amounts of magic in the form of air-breathing spells was still required to move the countless tons of stone, capped at the south end by the skeleton of a massive sea monster, some kind of ancient carnivorous whale. I don't have that much to say about this. I just wanted another excuse to show off my whale skeleton drawing, because I think it looks awesome. Back in ancient times, all the land that is now Laric was the territory of the Adar, that ancient civilization who developed the mystical powers of psionics. Contemporaries of the Atarans, the Adar were considered equally powerful in different ways. The two societies, along with the relatively primitive humans living under the banners of the descendants of the Smith, coexisted peacefully most of the time, helping each other when large threats arose, including the terrible Dead Wars. But after the death of the Atarans from the astral plague, the Adar became more insular, closing their borders to outsiders until one day, mere decades before the Orcs began the Shadow War, Adar messengers arrived in the courts of the Elves, the Dwarfholds, and each of the 3 brother nations. Their message was short and puzzling. We are tired of the interference of the gods. We are leaving. The only answer they gave to the flurry of questions that arose was that difficult times were coming. And with that, the messengers left. It was some time before scouts from the different nations braved the Adar borders, but they were unguarded. When these scouts began to report back to elves, dwarves, and men, they said the Adar were gone. Not just the people, but most of their buildings had vanished, save the island capital of Eloia. Even now, more than 1,000 years hence, nobody knows where the Adar went, or if they even still exist. At the time, their lands lay empty. The mystery terrified common folk, and it was many decades before the poorest and most adventurous of men from Verandi began to settle these lands to their south. But when those brave farmers came, they found much of the Adar territory filled by a new folk. Small folk. During the time of these ancient empires, the Halfling race arose, a rural folk who lived in a range of low hills wedged between Adar, Itara, and the mountains of the Iron Sea. They were small, and no one would have described them as powerful, but they fought off their own share of monsters and hardships, and when the Adar left, they were the first to move into their lands, wide fertile plains marred only by the occasional outcrop of strange crystals. When the first human settlers descended from Verandi, they found the halflings already well established, but there was enough space for everyone at first. Over the decades that followed, populations grew and there were scuffles and occasionally worse. The humans were literally twice to 3 times the height of the halflings, usually outmassing them 6 or 8 times over, but the halflings were always more united against any threat of violence, and their skill with slings allowed them to curtail many brawls with a well-placed warning shot, before things could escalate. When respect slowly grew between the two peoples, they began to form unified towns. Humans built their wood or stone houses, and the halflings would dig down, living in low-ceilinged underground homes, usually with herb gardens built over top, and strung together by tunnels in series. Each halfling home has a common room linked to the other homes, and the hamlet has only 2 or 3 exits to the surface, most of them hidden, allowing for easier defense. Meanwhile, over centuries, the halflings began to show signs of psionic powers, the same powers which were the hallmark of the ancient Adar. Some humans also became psionic, but it was far less common than among halflings, who, in my initial setting document, are a psionic race. They gain 1 power point at first level, while retaining all the usual halfling advantages, making halflings really bloody strong, though this does not apply to halfling sub-races from other books, only to standard PHB halflings. They formed the Psionic Academy as an organization to study the source and nature of these powers, and to study and protect the strange crystals left by the Adar and the mysterious island city of Eloia. The Academy has become a fairly powerful force in the politics of the Laric nation, which is virtually the only nation where mind control can be a viable legal defense. If you are charged with a crime, then by declaring that you committed that crime under the influence of mind control magic, you agree to submit to a test administered by the Academy. Now, the Psionic Academy are open about the fact that the process is imperfect. Mind control magic, by its nature, is quite difficult to detect after the fact. According to them, they cannot prove a negative, so they are unable to rule out the possibility that the subject was mind controlled. But if mind control was present, they claim there's a 60% chance that they can detect that influence. In this way, they can prove your innocence before the law, and you would be released with all charges dropped. However, the defendant must be certain and possibly desperate to claim this defense, because if the Academy does not detect the traces of mind control, which could happen even if they really were mind controlled, then that mind control plea effectively becomes a confession which can be used against you. Because of this, the defense is rarely used in practice. About 720 years ago, Laric had formalized their government as a mixed human-halfling nation, but they were experiencing some territorial pressures from the dwarves, who had essentially abandoned the 3 dwarfholds and moved into the old Itaran lands. The new dwarven nation, Tark, was a whole new experience for an industrious people whose traditional mode of living was to mine out every foot of space from solid rock. They had quickly become addicted to spreading out and claiming land and resources and the unparalleled new trade opportunities. Next to them, and to Verandi, the first of the 3 brother nations, Laric found that their own nation was not always taken seriously or treated with respect, because they were a relatively decentralized republic, and were sometimes seen as lacking the diplomatic standing to negotiate and enter long-term agreements with their monarchist neighbors. They voted slightly increased powers to their prime minister, and began changing their tradition of humble civic leaders to include more obvious trappings of power, but the real centerpiece of their plan to establish themselves as a major nation was to move their capital from the old township of Droma's Hedge into a new city which was built from the ground up to be a world-class capital city and seat of power, while also being positioned as a major nexus of trade between the Talaris-Tark routes and the northwestern human nations. The new city, built next to the old halfling community of Banapal, would be named Bankton, which was a declaration in the common tongue that they were open for business. It took over 40 years and several notable tax revolts, one of which very nearly became violent, before the core of Bankton was considered complete, with the Grand House of Representatives, the Embassy Quarter, the Ministerial Palace, the Chancery, the National Museum, and the First Bank of Laric, and construction by private funding continued ever since. The new government buildings were of a grand scale and architecture which forced foreign diplomats to recognize that they were dealing with a nation, not just a fly-by-night band of ragtag settlers. And the publicly owned First Bank was an enterprise which paid massive dividends over time. Not only had banking, money lending and safe deposits, never been attempted on such a scale, but they established branches in the dwarven capital, Tarkujan, and Varandi's famed capital, Forge, the city founded by the smith himself. These outposts of trade and their ability to make a deposit at one branch and later withdraw money from another were copied several times over by others, but being the first helped turn Bankton into an unrivaled center of trade, and the income funded much of the government going forward. I don't know when this history turned into an economic discussion, but just as much as wars and dragons, these are the forces that shape history. It is this wealth which funds the Psionic Academy, and which made possible the Laric counter-invasion, which was very important during the Diluvian conquest of Varandi, though largely forgotten by other nations. But that's a tale for another day. Also, I'm still too lazy to draw Bankton.